Okay, so now we're going to talk about journalism law, and we've talked a little bit about law before, so some of this should be a review. So where do our journalism laws come from? They come from the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is the most important law for journalists. And all journalism law comes from the First Amendment. It comes from the First Amendment in different ways, but it's all from the First Amendment. Remember the First Amendment. Here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Remember, Congress shall make no law. That means the government can't do it. The government can't do it, any government body. This includes police departments, a state-sponsored school, a city council, the student government at UNC. Remember that there are 5 protections in the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The one we're focused on is press. I'm not going to go over each protection. The only thing I want you to remember is that the protections are not absolute. There can be criteria that make them, in other words, they're not absolute. There are certain times when you can protest. You can't protest at any old time. You can't protest at midnight or things like that. You can't have your protest in the street. So you have to follow the laws. The freedom of the press, what that means is that journalists are free to criticize the government. Journalists are free to criticize the government. They won't get thrown in jail for criticizing the government. This is what used to happen before there was a United States. And in many countries, you can still get thrown in jail for criticizing the government. Remember that the press is the only profession named in the Bill of Rights. So we have a real privilege to do our jobs, but we also have a responsibility to follow the law and to act ethically. We have a responsibility to follow the law and to act ethically. And my presentation is not working. Okay, here we go. When we think about freedom of the press, we usually talk about case law, which means that judges have decided how the law is to be applied. Judges have interpreted the First Amendment. That's what judges do. Remember, they're the third branch of government, and they decide whether the laws are constitutional or not, and they interpret the laws. So that's where we get most of our laws about freedom of the press. Okay, there seems to be something wrong with the presentation. I don't know if this is going to work. There's something wrong with my computer. Okay. We're going to have to try this again another time. Oh, here it comes. Okay. All right. So there's different types of journalism laws. Censorship is the most important. Censorship is also known as prior restraint. Then we have libel. We have the privacy laws. We have open meetings laws. We have open records laws. And we have the Freedom of Information Act. And I'll go over each one. The first thing is censorship. Censorship is also known as prior restraint, which means that you're stopping publication before it happens. This is the worst thing that can happen because we want all the ideas to be out there in the public sphere so that they can be talked about and the best ideas will rise to the top. If you censor something, that idea doesn't get out there, and so the best idea can't rise to the top. The most important thing to remember with the First Amendment is that the government cannot censor you. The government cannot tell a newspaper or a TV station or a radio station that they can't run a story. The government cannot tell you what to write. Okay? Censorship is the worst thing that can happen because you want all the ideas out there. And this idea that the best ideas should rise to the top comes from John Milton, who was a famous writer, I believe in the 1600s. Okay, we've gone backwards. Let's see. Okay. Prior restraint is only allowed, and remember, when I say prior restraint, I mean censorship. The only time prior restraint is allowed is if the publication of the material will surely result in direct, immediate, and irreparable damage to the nation or its people. Notice that it says will surely result. Not may, not might, but surely. So it's got to be something pretty big. The main thing here is you're not going to say where the troops are, when the battle is going to start, when the bombing is going to begin, that kind of thing. You don't want to put the troops in danger. It's very rare that censorship is allowed. It's very rare that censorship is allowed. Okay, so libel. Libel is very important to know if you're going to be a journalist. Libel means damage to reputation caused by a published false statement. So libel has to be published and it has to be false. And libel is a civil case. In other words, you don't get put in jail if you're found guilty of libel. It's very rare that you would get put in jail. It can happen, but it's very rare. Usually it's a civil case, and what that means is one person is suing the other for money, for damages. One person is suing the other for damages. So if the mayor thinks that the Greeley Tribune has libeled him, he would sue the Greeley Tribune and the reporter. And if he won his case, he would get money from them. They would pay him money. Okay, so there's 5 things that have to happen for the plaintiff to be able to prove that it was libel. Now remember, the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. The plaintiff is the person who is bringing the libel suit. So the mayor would be the plaintiff. They have to prove it was published. Published means it reaches its audience. Doesn't have to be printed. It could be printed, it could be online, put online, it could be on the TV or on the radio. It could be in a book, it could be on a billboard. So it has to be published, it has to reach its audience. The person has to be identified. You have to know it's the mayor. It has to be defamatory. In other words, defamation means that the statement harms their reputation. It harms their reputation. It has to be false, and it has to be, we have to prove fault. And that's kind of sticky, so we'll go over that in a minute. But there's 5 things the plaintiff have to prove. You should know that. Know what the plaintiff has to prove to win a libel case. And then the degree of fault has to do with whether or not the person is a public figure or a private figure. If the person is a public figure, it's much harder to prove libel. If the person is a public figure. So, in other words, if it's the mayor, it's harder for him to prove libel. Or, Madonna would have a hard time proving libel. But you or me, since we're not famous, be easier for us to prove libel. And New York Times versus Sullivan is the court case. And basically what actual malice, and that has to do with actual malice. So if it's a public figure or a public official who's suing, the statement has to be made with knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for whether it was true or false. So in other words, the press has to do something really bad, because it's easier to, people whose names are always in the news are going to be at more risk for libel. So just know that public figures, it's easier to prove libel for a private person than for a public figure or public official. If it's a public official, you have to prove actual malice, which means that there was reckless disregard for the truth. If it's a private individual, probably just have to prove negligence, which just means the journalist should have been more careful. So it's much easier to prove. The best defense against a libel suit is always truth. If you print the truth or publish the truth, you will not be sued for libel, or you won't lose a libel suit. They can sue you, but if it's true, can't be proved libel. So always check your facts. Don't print rumors. Print the truth. If you've got a quote or a statement that makes it look like it might harm someone's reputation, you better check that. Make sure it's not libel. Privilege is an exception to the libel laws. If you are doing your job, then you can't be held liable. For instance, if you are at the city council meeting and one of the city council members calls another city council member a drunk, that might be harmful to that person's reputation. It might be false, but you've got to print it, or you've got to put it in your story because somebody said it at the city council meeting. So if you're doing your job, then it's not libel. Also, opinion cannot be proved libel because opinion can't be proven false. It's opinion. So if you say that you can say that the mayor is the worst mayor ever, and that's protected speech. You can't be held liable for that. But if you say the mayor is embezzling money, then that's something that can be proven false, and so that could be libel. So watch out. And just because you say I think doesn't mean it's opinion. So if you say I think the mayor is embezzling money, that's still libel. That could still be libel if it's false and if it harms a reputation. Privacy, I'm not going to go over privacy much. Just know that individuals have a right to privacy and you cannot infringe on their privacy to get your story. So if there's a fire, you can't just walk into someone's house because there was a fire as a reporter. You have to get permission. You have to get permission. Also, there's something called misappropriation. You cannot use famous people's names or likenesses to sell things without their permission because they can, like for instance, Peyton Manning, you wouldn't be able to use his face to sell your product because he can make money off his face. So don't put famous people or their pictures on your ads or press releases. It's illegal. Don't do it. Open meetings, just know that meetings are supposed to be open. Meetings of public bodies are open. So the Student Senate has to open its meeting. They have to provide the agenda 24 hours in advance. They have to open their meetings. They can't meet in secret. They can't vote in secret. All the government business has to be done in the open. If you are at a meeting, you're allowed to be there. Open records. If you want a record that's a public record, you should be able to get that. A lot of people, just know that you can get access to public records. In other words, government records. You can get them. Most records are open. So you can get them if you need them. You just have to know where to go. And most newspapers or news outlets have a lawyer that you can talk to. So talk to your editor, first of all, and find out, where do I get this? Remember, records are open. You can get them. Just might be difficult. The last thing is the Freedom of Information Act, and the Freedom of Information Act has to do with federal government. You can get information from the federal government. You just have to do it in the correct way. So just Google Freedom of Information Act, and you go to the government body that you want the information from, and you can get it. So listen, law is important. Don't libel anyone. That's about all I have.